Dante's Paradiso, Cantos 1 through 11. In the Paradiso, Dante and Beatrice ascend through the 9 spheres of the universe and then pass into the Empyrean, beyond the boundary of time and space. And Dante finds that every sphere feels more joyful and radiant than the previous one. Every time that Dante seems to have reached his limit, he finds the next level even more extraordinary. Dante's joy is his reward for the hardship of his journey up to this point. At the same time, Beatrice explains more and more about the workings of God and the universe. So everything that Dante has seen makes more and more sense. After the horrors of hell and the hardships of purgatory, we finally understand the secrets of the Christian universe. In Dante's theology, the earth is at the center of the universe, surrounded by a series of heavenly spheres, like the layers of an onion. Dante and Beatrice must visit each of the 10 heavens in turn from lowest to highest as his comprehension expands and he passes through each of the stage of revelation. This is continuously symbolized by Dante's increasing ability in each sphere to see yet more of Beatrice's beauty and the ever more pervading light of the Lord as he is successfully prepared for higher visions. As Dante is still mortal, he has limitations. He perceives the souls in paradise to be on different spheres according to their rank, only at the end seeing them all united in fellowship with God in the Empyrean. So the Empyrean is this top level up here at the top of the screen, and these other spheres are the planets where he visits the souls. So he visits them in each level, but later on he finds out that they're actually all in the Empyrean, and they just show up on these planets mostly for his benefit. He lacks the omniscience and the ability to read minds of the other souls. They can read his mind when he's visiting them. In fact, a lot of times he has a question for them, and before he even asks it, they start to answer it. And his memory cannot cope and struggles to recall reflections of divine splendor that surpass earthly understanding. On each sphere, as his comprehension is widened and he moves closer to God, this is partly achieved through knowledge and theological understanding. Dante is educated about the fundamental nature of creation, and the reader is instructed as well, as this is the most important part of the prophetic message which Dante must spread on the earth. There are regular denunciations of earthly corruption by heavenly figures, continuing Dante's original theme of the rotten state of Italy, but such blinkered concerns are largely transcended in paradise. Dante stresses that individuality is not lost in heaven, but perfected, and therein lies the glory of the salvation of humanity. Every soul in paradise offers a love which is unique and wonderful. Canto 1, Gazing at the Sun and Ascending into the Heavens. Okay, so at this point they are still in the earthly paradise, or the Garden of Eden, at the top of Mount Purgatory. Beatrice gazes into the sun, and Dante does too. Because of his enhanced faculties, he seems to see the sky filled with the sun's fire, and he hears the heavenly music of the spheres. Seeing his amazement, Beatrice says that they have left the earth and are rising towards the heavens at an incredible speed. Dante asks how this is possible and says that the soul naturally tends towards God, and now that Dante is unshackled from his earthly preoccupations, his soul is free to soar. So the sun represents God's love, and this is what kind of powers everything in the world. You remember on Mount Purgatory, they could only go up the mountain during the day when the sun was shining on them. Okay, so basically only with the help of God's love and grace could they go up, and now as they ascend into heaven, the thing that gives them the power to ascend into heaven is also the light from God's love and grace. All right. Just as gravity on Earth pulls us towards the Earth and lets us stand up on the Earth and not fall away from it, so now that he's reached the top of Mount Purgatory and has been totally purified, the attraction of God, which is kind of symbolized by the sun here, the attraction of God is a greater gravitational pull than the attraction of the Earth, and Dante is pulled towards God. And in heaven, all people are pulled towards God. Canto 2, the moon, which is the first sphere of heaven. So the spheres of heaven are the planets. At least they're the planets that were known at the time of that Dante lived, around the year 1300. So we have the Earth, and this is actually what's called the Ptolemaic astronomical system. This is there was an astronomer named Ptolemy who lived around the time of Christ, who figured out how astronomy worked. At least he thought he did. And basically figured out that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and then you had these different planets that circled in different layers of the heavens that were totally separate from each other. So you had the moon, then Mercury, then Venus, then the sun, then Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, then the stars, and then the Prima Mobile, and then the Empyrean. So obviously these are not quite the same as we would consider the planets today. The moon, for instance, we don't usually consider as a planet, or the sun, but these are the heavenly bodies that could be seen from Earth, and that's why they end up in these layers. And the astronomers at that time had determined that some of them were closer to Earth than others, mostly based on their astronomical observations. Canto 2, the moon, which is the first sphere of heaven, and the level of people who broke their vows in life. So Dante finds that he and Beatrice have ascended into the first sphere, that of the moon, and they are inside the moon itself. So they're not on the moon, they're actually inside it. Dante takes the opportunity to ask the explanation for the spots on the moon, which can be seen from Earth. Beatrice shows the errors of his earthly understanding, rebutting his ideas with scientific analysis. Then she unveils an aspect of the workings of providence. Space can only be understood in spiritual terms. God and paradise exist in the Empyrean, outside the spheres of the universe, but enveloping it. The outer sphere, the crystalline, pressing against the Empyrean and presses against the Empyrean and is infused by God's love. This love, as it soaks through the crystalline, is directed and given various qualities by the penultimate sphere, that of the stars. From the stars to the center of the universe, the earth, the heavenly qualities filter down as determined by the stars. Thanks to the will of the angels, this imbues each of the 7 other heavenly spheres with their particular celestial qualities, and all these spheres and divine impulses influence earthly existence. Canto 3, Piccarda. Dante sees spirits nearby as faint reflections. They are on the lowest sphere of the heavens, the moon, because they lapsed in their vows during life. So Dante speaks with Piccarda Donati, who is the sister of Foris and Corso. We met Foris in Purgatorio, Canto 24. Dante asks whether she is content to be on this lowest sphere, and Piccarda says that her will is one with God's, and so she is joyful of her place. And this is true of all the souls in heaven, is that regardless of how high or low they are in heaven, they are happy with their place because they love the will of God. She explains that she ended up here after being removed from her nunnery by evil men, implicitly her brother Corso, who is in hell. So she took the vows as a nun, but her brother forcibly removed her from the nunnery, from the convent, and then forced her to marry somebody. So this was her situation. And there's another lady that's there on the moon with her, and her name is Constance, and she was the empress. And she also had a similar situation where she made vows to be a nun, and then her family forced her to leave the convent and marry. And so it's not completely their fault that they left their vows because they were forced to, but still, because of that, they are on the lowest level of heaven, which is the moon. In Canto 4, Dante asks a few questions about this situation. He asks first about if the planets. So Plato had taught that people's souls come from the stars of the planets and then return to them after their death. And Beatrice clears up this area of confusion for him. First of all, she says all saved souls, all souls that are in heaven, are actually in the Empyrean for all eternity. None of them have greater or lesser access to the fruits of paradise. But because human faculties are limited, that they perceive divine things imperfectly, so because of that, and for basically for Dante's benefits, the souls that he's meeting are shown on the planets, on the 9 planets, or heavenly spheres, and to show so that Dante can see what level of heaven they're in. In actuality, all of them are in the Empyrean with God, but they do experience God in a greater or lesser way, depending on what level of heaven they're assigned to. And so the planets kind of symbolize that. But souls do not come from the stars or planets and then return to them. And so she says if that's what Plato meant, then he was in error. Then Dante asks that if Piccarda was forced to leave the nunnery, she was, and also not just Piccarda, but also Constance were forced to leave the convent. Why would that be held against them? And Beatrice says that the fact that Piccarda was reluctant to leave the nunnery and did so because of the evil of others was not enough to pardon her fault. Ultimately, she let it happen to her rather than fully resisting. She also brings up the idea of practical will versus absolute will. The practical will is basically where you have to make decisions to do what's practical, to do what needs to be done in a certain situation. And the absolute will is basically that you what you want to do deep inside your soul. And so there's this contradiction between the two. But in the end, Piccarda could have done something else to make sure that her vows were not violated, right? But it would have probably cost her more dearly. And since she wasn't willing to make that sacrifice, that's why she ends up on the lowest level of heaven. But she's still in heaven, and she's very happy with the situation, and so there's no problem with it, really. Canto 5, the importance of free will to God, and then moving on to Mercury, the second sphere. So, in response to Dante's questions about whether a broken vow can be compensated for by other good deeds, Beatrice says that free will is the supreme gift to humanity. Again, this is going back to, she talked about this in Purgatorio also, free will as being extremely important, right? And this is one of the themes of Dante's book, is that free will, or the ability to make a choice that we have, is a gift from God, and is something that is extremely important. And so because of that, a vow, which is where you are promising to do something, a voluntary suspension of free will, you're giving up your free will to say, I will do this thing in spite of what I want, is a supreme sacrifice, worth more in God's eyes than any alternative offerings. The actual matter of the vow may be changed by remittances, but the new form of the vow must be weightier than the original vow. However, it's better to break a vow than to commit a worse crime, such as killing one's daughter, to keep it. After this, they zoom up to the second sphere, that of Mercury, and as its souls approach, Dante asks them questions. And here you see the picture of the host of myriad glowing souls. All the souls in heaven glow, all right? They give off a light. And that light is like a reflection of God's love, of God's grace. And Beatrice also gives off this light. In fact, Beatrice is like Dante's sun, right? She is the thing that attracts him into heaven and then leads him through heaven. And so through a lot of it, he's looking at Beatrice to see the light of the sun. And then sometimes her gaze directs him to look on to the sun. So, and whenever he does that, she's happy that he is not focusing so much on her anymore, but is now focusing more on God's grace and God's love directly. Canto 6, Mercury. So they move. So far, they've gone to the moon. Now on to Mercury, and you can see that each of these planets has a fault that's associated with it. So the people on these levels are not exactly being punished for these faults, but they had these faults, and so because of this, they're assigned to this level of heaven. At least the first three are different faults. All right, so you have the inconstant, those who were not able to keep their vows. On Mercury, you have the ambitious, or those who had self-centered motives. And on Mercury, he meets Justinian, the Roman emperor. This is the only canto narrated entirely by one speaker, in this case, the Emperor Justinian, the Roman or Byzantine emperor who oversaw the 6th century reconquest of Italy by the Eastern Roman Empire. He talks about the glorious history of the Roman Empire and its great Christian destiny. And he kind of gives a summary of that history in his speech. This is an opportunity to condemn the pro- and anti-imperial factions in Dante's Italy, that is, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, because they are all subverting this destiny. Again, Dante believes that ultimately it would be best if the emperor and the pope both ruled independent of each other, not one ruling over the other. And of course, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines disagree because the Guelphs think that the Pope should be the ultimate authority on earth politically, and that the Ghibellines believe that the Emperor should be the ultimate authority on earth politically. And what Dante is saying in several places in the book, and what Beatrice is telling him, and Virgil tells him, his basic revelation is that really the Pope and the Emperor should be equal powers, that both rule independently and equally without interference from each other. And together, cooperating together, they lead the people of God to a good place. But when they fight against each other, as is happening in Italy with the Guelph and Ghibelline struggle, it causes problems, and you end up with all the corruption and troubles of medieval Italy. So the sphere of Italy, or the sphere of Mercury, Justinian explains, is for souls who did good things, but whose motives were too self-interested or too self-centered. So they did it for their own honor and glory rather than for a pure motive, out of the love of God. Canto 7, the crucifixion and how it is possible for us to have salvation. So anticipating Dante's next question, Beatrice, by the way, that happens throughout. You'll notice as you read the book that the spirits in heaven can read Dante's mind. So as soon as he thinks of a question, they answer it before he even asks it. He can't read their minds, and so he has to listen to their explanation, but they can read his mind. So anticipating his next question, Beatrice explains how the crucifixion was simultaneously a just penalty against humanity's sin and a crime against Christ, which itself deserved punishment. So at the same time, God's by Christ's sacrifice on the cross, we are saved from sin. Basically, she goes through the idea that people commit sins, and in order to be saved from their sins, to have salvation, to be able to go to heaven, they need to be able to do something to make up for it. But because of our limitations, we are not able to do that. And so since it was a sin against God, it's an eternal sin, and so only God can make up that sin, and that's why God himself has to come to give the sacrifice on the cross. All right, so that's the first part. But the second part is that the crime against Christ, which is the fact that he was crucified by the Jews and the Romans, deserved punishment as well. And that punishment came with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. This was seen as a form of revenge against the Jews for killing the Messiah, at least in medieval times. Beatrice goes on to explain how only sin can cut off an immortal soul from its direct link to God. Because humanity used its free will to fall into sin, it could only be saved by God pardoning it and undermining our free will, or by humanity saving itself. So God did not want to undermine our free will, and it was impossible for humanity on its own to give satisfaction for original sin. God gave himself as a man in the form of Christ to enable us to save ourselves. So that's why God had to become man. So the resurrection lets us keep our free will and also attain redemption. Canto 8. They move on to the sphere of Venus. So they've been to the moon, which was for the inconstant, Mercury, which was for the ambitious or those who are self-interested motives, and then we go to Venus, which was for lovers. And of course, in Roman and Greek mythology, the goddess Venus is the god of love, and that's where this association comes in. So the third sphere is Venus, where Dante encounters Charles Martel of Anjou, a member of the Capetian royal family. This is not to be confused with the other Charles Martel, who was the forefather of Charlemagne and who had helped keep the Muslims out of France. This is a Charles Martel who comes 500 years later and lived at the time of Dante. Dante knew him personally, and he was someone that Dante believed would have brought harmony to Italy and helped stop the fighting between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, but he unfortunately died prematurely from the plague. The rest of his royal family has caused disorder and disaster. That would be the French royal family, the Capetian royal family. And Charles Martel explains that human nature and destiny is determined by providence rather than by one's family. So this comes from a question that Dante asks about why certain sons of a king might be good rulers and others would be bad. Some might be really fit to be king and others are terrible. And that's because, as Charles tells him, that providence or God's will determines what role a person should play in life. And if they end up pursuing the wrong career, so to speak, then they are ineffective at it and they're bad at it. And this is what happens a lot of times, and apparently what happened with a lot of the rest of the French royal family, and that's why they end up being such an evil influence on Europe at this time, causing the division between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and feeding into that civil war that's been going on in Italy between them. So, Canto 9, we're still on Venus here, the level of unrestrained love. All right, so the people that are people that are on this level were good people, and they had a lot of love, but their love was not restrained. They didn't know when to stop or when to, and so they loved some earthly things too much, or earthly people too much, and didn't restrain it for the good of things. So there's some examples given here of that, which is Falco and Cunizza. Falco and Cunizza. So Falco is a troubadour who repented, and Cunizza is a woman who was married multiple times and had several husbands, but then repented. And then Falco also points out that Rahab, the prostitute who helped Joshua to win the Battle of Jericho, is also on this level. And again, these are people that had unrestrained love in their life but repented and are therefore are in heaven now. There are some more digs made at the terrible state of Florence in Italy in this canto. And then from Venus, they move up to the next sphere, which is the sphere of the sun. And they're going to go inside the sun, which is the place where, for those who were wise or prudent. So, and they're going to meet Thomas Aquinas there on this fourth sphere. So Canto 10, the fourth sphere of heaven, the sun. Dante and Beatrice appear in the fourth sphere of the sun. Dante emphasizes the joy, light, and love, which are interchangeable symbols of each other, and which have been increasing with each sphere. Thomas Aquinas is there, and he lists to Dante the wise scholars, religious leaders, and theologians who inhabit the sphere. They include Albert, Seeger, Solomon, Boethius, who of course wrote one of our books earlier this year, Gratian, Peter Lombard, Dionysius the Areopagite, Isidore, and Bede. So interestingly, one of the ones that Thomas Aquinas lists is Seeger, who was a philosopher who had a totally different take on how the world works than Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, of course, was the medieval theologian who basically reconciles classical philosophy, especially Aristotle, to Christianity. And Seeger had a totally different approach, which Thomas Aquinas did not agree with. But yet both of them are in heaven together, and in fact on the same level. And it shows how different from some of the other levels, some of the other places that Dante has been in this book, that in heaven people live in harmony and love for each other, even if they were perhaps opponents of some sort on earth, as Thomas Aquinas and Seeger were. Canto 11, Francis of Assisi, and also St. Dominic. So they're still on the level of the Son, and Thomas Aquinas, who is a Dominican, tells Dante the story of St. Francis of Assisi and the Franciscans, presenting it as a story of love between St. Francis and Lady Poverty. He describes St. Francis as a font of love, the founder of a brilliant religious order, and a worthy prince of the church. He then also talks a little bit about St. Dominic. He also talks about how St. Francis received the stigmata from Christ at the end of his life. He also briefly mentions St. Dominic, who was the founder of St. Thomas Aquinas' own order, and how great he was just as great as St. Francis. And he criticizes the modern decadence of his fellow Dominicans, people who have kind of fallen away from the original founding principles that St. Dominic set up. So, and this is also significant because the Franciscans and the Dominicans were the two major political movement, or not political, major religious movements of the previous century to when Dante lived. And there was some disagreement, amongst Christians at the time about what was the right way to go, right? St. Francis emphasizes the idea of living a life of poverty and complete dependence on God. And St. Dominic emphasizes the need to preach the gospel to people, and he has the order of preachers. And there were other differences too. But again, in heaven, these differences are reconciled, and St. Francis and St. Dominic are on the same level, and in a union of love, because they were both ultimately working for the same thing, which is for Christ.